You think you are living in the present moment. You feel like right now, this very instant, is when you exist. But here's the funny thing about that feeling. It is wrong. Not poetically wrong, not philosophically debatable, but measurably, demonstrably, physically wrong. And the reason why is one of the most beautiful and slightly unsettling discoveries about how your brain actually works. Let me start with something simple. Light travels fast, stupendously fast, about 300 million meters per second. So when you look at your hand right in front of your face, the light bouncing off your hand reaches your eyes in something like half a nanosecond. That is so close to zero that nobody would blame you for calling it instantaneous. And for a long time, people did exactly that. They assumed that seeing was immediate, that the world you perceive is the world as it is, right now, in this exact moment. But that assumption starts to crack the moment you look a little closer at what actually happens between the world sending information and your brain doing something with it. Here is what has to happen just for you to see your hand. Light hits the surface of your skin, bounces off, and travels into your eye. It hits the retina, which is a thin sheet of cells at the back of your eyeball. Those cells have to absorb the light, convert it into an electrochemical signal, and then that signal has to travel along the optic nerve through a relay station deep in the brain called the thalamus, and then all the way to the visual cortex at the back of your head. And then the brain has to do something with that signal. It has to interpret it, construct a picture from it, recognize it as a hand, and bring it into what you experience as conscious awareness. Now here's the thing. That whole chain of events is not instantaneous. It takes time. Real, measurable, physical time. The signal traveling along a nerve fiber does not move at the speed of light. Not even close. Nerve signals travel somewhere between about 0.5 meters per second at the slow end and maybe 120 meters per second at the fast end for the most heavily insulated fibers. That is still fast compared to, say, a person walking. But compared to 300 million meters per second, it is embarrassingly slow. So just getting the signal from your retina to your visual cortex already takes a few milliseconds. Then the actual processing, the computation your brain does to figure out what it is looking at, adds more time on top of that. Scientists have measured this very carefully. The total delay between a visual event happening in the world and you consciously perceiving it is roughly 80 to 100 milliseconds. About a tenth of a second. Now, a tenth of a second sounds tiny. You might say, so what? Who cares about a tenth of a second? But let me show you why you should care very deeply about this. Think about what it means. Right now, as you are watching this, you are not seeing the world as it is. You are seeing the world as it was about 80 milliseconds ago. That is not a metaphor. That is a literal, physical delay built into the hardware of your nervous system. The present you experience is actually a very recent past. You are, at this very moment, living in a memory. A memory so fresh it feels like now, but a memory nonetheless. And here is where it gets more interesting, because the visual system is not the only one with this problem. Sound takes time to process too. Touch takes time. The signals from your feet take longer to reach your brain than the signals from your face, simply because your feet are farther away. If you step on something sharp, the signal from your foot has to travel all the way up your spinal cord before your brain knows anything happened. That takes longer than the signal from your fingertip by a noticeable amount. So here is the puzzle your brain faces. It is receiving information from all over your body, and all of those signals are arriving at slightly different times. The light you see, the sound you hear, the touch you feel, they are all processed with different delays. If the brain just played them back in the order they arrived, your experience of the world would be a smeared, poorly synchronized mess. Things that happened at the same time would seem to happen at different times. You would see your hand clap and hear the sound at slightly different moments. The world would feel weirdly out of sync. But it does not feel that way. And that is because your brain is doing something extraordinarily clever. It is not just a passive receiver, just sitting there waiting for signals to come in and then reporting them in real time. It is more like an editor. A very fast, very sophisticated editor that takes all these differently delayed streams of information, figures out when each event actually occurred in the physical world, lines them all up correctly, and then presents you with a smoothly coherent, synchronized version of reality. And here is the critical part. It cannot do that editing job until it has waited long enough for all the relevant signals to arrive. So it introduces a deliberate delay. It holds everything back just a little while, gathers all the inputs, does the synchronization, and then plays you the finished, edited version. That finished version is what you call the present moment. But by the time you are experiencing it, the real physical events that created it are already about 80 milliseconds in the past. Now this raises a fascinating question. How does this editing work exactly? Because it is not obvious. Imagine the brain is like a film editor working on a movie. The camera operators are all over the set, some close to the action, some far away. Their footage arrives at the editing room at slightly different times, depending on how far away they were shooting and how fast their runners can carry the film canisters. A bad editor would just stick the footage together in the order it arrived. The result would be chaos. A good editor looks at the footage, figures out what was actually happening simultaneously on set, and cuts it together so that it tells a coherent story. Your brain is that good editor. And just like a real editor, it needs a little buffer time before it can start assembling the final cut. There is actually experimental evidence for exactly this kind of temporal editing. There is a phenomenon called the flash lag effect. If you take a moving object and briefly flash a stationary object right next to it, the stationary flash appears to lag behind the moving object, even though physically they were in the same place at the same time. The brain, because it is trying to predict where moving objects will be, ends up placing them slightly ahead of where they actually were. It is making an educated extrapolation about the moving object, and this mismatch reveals the machinery of the editing process. There is also something called temporal order judgment experiments, where scientists present two stimuli in very rapid succession and ask people to say which one came first. Below about 30 to 50 milliseconds of separation, people genuinely cannot tell. The brain lumps them together into a single moment. Above that threshold, they can detect the order. This tells you something very concrete about the granularity of the brain's clock. The brain is not measuring time with infinite precision. It is working with chunks, with windows of time, and events that fall within the same window get assigned to the same subjective moment. And here is a deeper layer to this. Different parts of the brain are processing different aspects of what you perceive, and they do not all finish at the same time. Color is processed faster than motion. Shape is processed faster than certain kinds of texture. So even within a single sensory modality like vision, different features of the same event are arriving at conscious awareness with slightly different timings. The brain has to stitch all of those together too. It is not just synchronizing across different senses, it is synchronizing within a single sense. The unity of your perceptual experience, the feeling that you are seeing one coherent scene rather than a patchwork of separately processed features, that unity is a construction, something the brain builds actively out of raw materials that are temporally scattered. This starts to connect to a much deeper question, which is what the present moment actually is, physically. Now, physicists have thought about this quite carefully. In special relativity, the concept of a universal present moment does not really exist. There is no single slice of space-time that you can point to and say this is now everywhere in the universe. Simultaneity is relative. Events that appear to be simultaneous to one observer appear to happen at different times to another observer moving at a different velocity. The present is not a feature of the universe. It is a feature of a particular observer in a particular state of motion. But even setting aside relativity, even just thinking about your own body in your own frame of reference, the present moment you experience is not a knife-edge instant. It cannot be. An instant has no duration, and something with no duration cannot contain any information. A true zero-duration moment is just a point, and a point cannot be seen or felt or heard. Perception requires duration. You need some stretch of time in order to detect a sound, because a sound is a pattern in time. You need some stretch of time to detect motion. You need a window. And that window, that minimum chunk of experience time, has to be big enough to contain the patterns you are detecting. This is sometimes called the psychological present or the specious present. It is the feeling that what you are experiencing right now is not a dimensionless point, but has some felt duration to it. Researchers have estimated the specious present at somewhere around 2 to 3 seconds. That is the window within which events feel like they are all happening now rather than one after another. So your subjective present moment is not a point in time. It is a smear about 2 or 3 seconds wide, roughly centered about 80 milliseconds or so behind the objective physical world. Now I want to push this even further because there is another layer that people often miss. The brain does not just compensate for its own processing delays passively. It actively predicts. If you're going to catch a ball, you do not wait for the signal from your retina to tell you where the ball is right now and then command your arm to move. By the time all that processing was done, the ball would already be somewhere else. Instead, the brain runs a model. It tracks the ball, extrapolates its trajectory, predicts where it will be in the near future, and sends movement commands based on that prediction. You are reaching toward where the brain calculates the ball will be, not where it sees the ball now. This predictive machinery is running all the time, not just for catching balls. For everything. For understanding speech. The brain is constantly predicting what the next word will be based on context before it has finished processing the current one. For maintaining balance. The brain is predicting how the ground will feel under your next step. Perception itself is deeply predictive. The signals coming in from your senses are not used to construct your experience from scratch each moment. They are used to update and correct a model that the brain is already running. What you see and hear and feel is largely a prediction, continuously refined by incoming data. And that prediction is also not immediate. It takes time to update. If something genuinely unexpected happens, something that violates the brain's predictions sharply, there is a slight lag while the system figures out what is going on. That lag is sometimes called prediction error, and you can actually see evidence of it in brain imaging. Unexpected stimuli produce a characteristic signal in the brain about 100 to 200 milliseconds after they appear, which corresponds to the brain saying, "Wait, that does not match what I expected. Let me update my model." So what are you, in terms of your relationship to time? You are a sophisticated signal processing system that is always receiving information from a very recent past, assembling it into a coherent narrative, filling in gaps with predictions, smoothing over inconsistencies, and presenting the whole finished product to your conscious awareness as the present moment. The present moment feels immediate and direct and vivid, but it is none of those things. It is constructed. It is delayed. It is, in a very precise technical sense, a story your brain is telling you about events that have already happened. And there is something philosophically interesting about this, which I find worth sitting with for a moment. Your sense of being present, your sense of being right here, right now in the flow of time, that feeling is real. The experience of nowness is genuinely what it feels like from the inside. But that feeling does not correspond to a physical instant. It corresponds to a neural process. A process that takes time, uses prediction, involves memory, and operates with a built-in lag. The feeling of now is a biological product, not a window onto physics. There is no moment when your brain is perfectly synchronized with external reality. It is always playing catch-up, always predicting, always editing. The gap is usually small enough that it does not matter. For most of what we do, 80 milliseconds is negligible. You can still have a conversation, you can still navigate a room, you can still catch things and interact with other people without any noticeable problem from this delay. Evolution did not need us to be perfectly synchronized, it just needed us to be close enough. But every now and then this delay becomes visible. In fast sports, athletes train themselves to work with their predictive systems, to override the delayed perceptual feedback and move based on anticipation. In music, highly trained musicians are compensating for processing delays in ways they are not even consciously aware of. In reaction time studies, the best reactions humans can produce are still bounded by this physiological floor. The really striking thing, to me at least, is that this is not a bug. It is a feature. The slight delay, the predictive filling in, the temporal smoothing, these are all part of what makes your experience of the world stable and coherent instead of jittery and fragmented. You trade a small amount of temporal accuracy for a lot of perceptual stability. Given that the world is mostly continuous and mostly predictable, this is an excellent trait. The brain evolved to live in a world of patterns, and it optimized for tracking those patterns smoothly, not for perfect instantaneous accuracy. So the next time you feel absolutely certain about what is happening right now, remember that right now is slightly more complicated than it seems. The signals have traveled, the processing has taken time, the editing has been done, and what you are experiencing is the polished final cut, delivered to you about 80 milliseconds after the raw footage was shot. You are not late to the party. You are exactly where the hardware puts you. And the hardware, whatever else you want to say about it, is doing something quite remarkable with a signal that was already in the past before you ever knew it arrived.